Thank you very much. Can I welcome our witnesses this afternoon? Edward Woodall from the Association of Convenience Stores, Liz Vann from the Chartered Institute of Environmental Health, Rachel Hallam, who's the chair of the Fireworks Enforcement Liaison Group, and Dr. Paul Logan, who's Director of Chemicals, Explosives and Biological Hazards Division at the Health and Safety Executive. Thank you very much for coming this afternoon. As you know, we have already heard in this inquiry from one of those who wants more control on fireworks. We've also heard from the manufacturers, and we want to try and get your professional opinion on some of the issues that have been raised with us in this inquiry. So, can I start by asking you, Dr. Logan, please, what would you say to those who say that fireworks are explosives, they're by definition potentially dangerous, and therefore should only be handled by people who are professionally qualified?
Interesting question. I mean, obviously, there's a long history of people using them domestically. We do have legislation controlling the manufacture and the storage and the licensed sale of those explosives, but ultimately people take them home. So realistically, they do need to be as safe as possible, and they need to be tested to be seen to be safe, and they need to be licensed for that purpose. The reality is, if people follow the instructions, I think, this is outside HSE's remit when we get into consumer, but, like many families, we were brought up burning fireworks on a particular night of the year, and generally, if people follow the instructions, they can be handled quite safely.
Well, by allowing garden fireworks, are we clinging to a tradition that's a bit outdated? I would appreciate the panel's views on that. Let's be honest, we wouldn't start from here, would we? Are there dangers in the approach that we currently have? Who wants to take? Paul?
Well, that's outside, anything I would say on this would just be pure opinion. It wouldn't be, it's outside HSE's remit, the domestic use of fireworks. So I don't know whether any of the colleagues...
It is, but I just, as someone who deals with explosives, I'd just like your opinion on that. Are we taking unacceptable risks?
Well, purely as opinion,
yes.
Then I would say no if they're being handled and used correctly.
Anyone else want to come in on that one?
I just add that
Rachel.
They are designed to be used in certain areas and labelled as such. So there are different categories of fireworks which give different safety distances. So depending on the size of the garden, there should be a firework suitable.
Okay. Well, we'll come back to that one because there's a question of whether they're always handled in the right way. Can I ask Liz Vann to comment on another thing? We held an engagement event with military veterans who found that not only the noise of fireworks, but the colours, the lights and so on could really have a traumatic effect on them and cause flashbacks. They had a real impact on people who had PTSD and so on. And they were suggesting that anyone who wanted to set off fireworks, even in their garden, should have a permit, and that the dates and times of those displays should be published. So I want to ask you whether you think a system like that is feasible and whether local authorities would be able to cope with it.
I think that a permit system may work to help identify where they are. However, for households, every household to have a permit, I think that would be too resource intensive. The other thing is, if you did decide, or if there was a... Could
I ask all witnesses to speak up and into the microphone, please, for the benefit of those listening or watching the TV feed?
For the other thing is that within Torfaen Council and within South Wales, we actually do a registration scheme for organised events, which works quite well.
But you think that, I don't want to put words into your mouth, are you saying that a councils could not cope with a system where domestic displays needed a permit? And is there a possibility that any scheme like that could be self-funding, that you'd have to pay for your permit?
It is feasible, but I honestly don't think that it would work from the point of view for the fact that there are just too many. And obviously it is very transient as well.
That councils wouldn't have the resources to administer such a system?
It wouldn't just be the council. You may also have issues with perhaps the police as well needing to get involved. So if somebody was doing something without a permit, then obviously we would need to have assistance possibly to attend.
Okay, thank you. I'll pass the questioning to my colleague Catherine McKinnell.
Thank you, Chair. I'll ask you my first question as well, Liz. There's been some disagreement expressed between the petitioners and the fireworks industry about the extent of the problem caused by fireworks. The industry have pointed to freedom of information requests to suggest that the problem is relatively rare. Is there any reason why there may be a bigger problem than is currently being recorded? Do you have a comment on the suggestion that it is relatively rare?
Within our own local authority, we usually get about one complaint.
One complaint
a year.
A year, yeah.
And that is usually outside of the firework time.
Right.
Usually for events and things like that. However, doing the registration scheme, I've dealt with about 4 complaints over the sort of since 2010 when we started doing it, and they vary considerably from people with animals to complaints about neighbours. It is difficult to actually enforce any sort of legislation relating to statutory nuisance when you're looking at something like fireworks. It is a transient time. It is classed as acceptable, so it would be difficult. Again, sometimes with complainants, they don't want to discuss any issues because of the neighbours. They want to keep that community spirit and perhaps don't like asking people things.
So do you think that the level of nuisance that people experience and the level of discontent is possibly not recorded in the actual recorded figures of actual complaints? Doesn't that necessarily translate into complaints? Is that what you're saying? Yeah. Do you think, is there any differentiation across the country, do you know, that you're aware of? Are there some areas where there are more complaints than others?
Again, I can only sort of go on what I'm aware of within our authority, but it is my understanding that most environmental health officers would not take a complaint relating to fireworks around about fireworks time.
Right, okay.
Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chairman. So it's been suggested from representatives of the fireworks industry that most of the problems surrounding fireworks, the antisocial behaviour, noise, misuse, are because of illegally imported fireworks, and that illegal action in itself being antisocial is actually, so those people who are getting those fireworks are intending to use them in that way, if you like. Would that be your experience, in your professional experience?
Again,
I think from a trading standards perspective, we've seen a shift in the way that we get information. So historically, someone would ring up. It tends to be a lot more social media now that people will make comments about fireworks going off, about them coming in, them being advertised online. So it's not just the traditional shops that we're used to going in and inspecting. People have different routes for getting them. So we're going out, we're doing our inspections and not seeing a problem with underage sales. So from an enforcement perspective, things are going the way that we want them to. However, there is an undercurrent that I think Steve from Bright Star mentioned last week, that there's this illegal activity, but from an enforcement perspective, if we don't get to know about that illegal activity, then we can't take any enforcement action against it. So we're in a challenging position that if it's not reported, then we have to either go out and be proactive and look for it, if we know where to look, or wait for somebody to tell us about it.
Would anybody else like to comment on?
So, can you just repeat the question?
So basically what I'm saying is that the fireworks industry is saying that a lot of the antisocial problems to do with fireworks and the misuse of fireworks are because of illegally obtained and imported fireworks. So would that be your view? If they're intent on getting illegal fireworks, it's not because they want to have them for a nice display in their garden. If they're illegally getting hold of them, it's because they're wanting to misuse the fireworks in some way.
I haven't got any sort of statistics. I don't do a lot with antisocial behaviour, but I would probably say that if anybody wanted to get a firework, they can get it illegally or legally and still use it in a similar manner. So if they wanted to use it for as a weapon, then they could. You know, it doesn't have to be underage. It doesn't have to be, you know, purchased illegally.
Okay. Anything to add? No? Could I ask you then about enforcement? Do you think existing enforcement laws need to be stepped up? And you mentioned social media, and social media is very of the moment. So if somebody's doing something illegal and it's reported on social media that it's happening right then, in a moment in time, then enforcement agencies are not waiting an hour or the day later or a week later for somebody to complain or to write to their local MP. You know, they can tackle that pretty quickly, can't they?
If it's reported to us, I think you'll find there's a lot of social media activity and complaints happen around local community groups, and it's not unless someone steps up and makes that report to the police or makes the report to the fire service or in fact training standards that we get that information. And unfortunately, because the time period for fireworks is so condensed, that if somebody's advertising a firework on a Thursday, it might be sold or set off by the Friday or the Saturday, and to create enough of an enforcement team, multi-agency operation to try and address that, it can be quite challenging in such a short space of time. It is possible, and actions have been taken, but it's not always possible to get that information from social media in a clear and accurate way, because we know people don't always use their own names. They don't necessarily put addresses and things to be able to track them down, so quite a lot of work may have to go on in the background to actually find those sellers in the first place.
So would you say there's maybe a lack of resources in tackling this, or do you think at those moments, you know, before the event where you think people might be selling fireworks, that something could be done beforehand to monitor, especially if it's a recurrent problem? So quite often it's around a certain time, but it might be because certain people are selling illegal fireworks because they know there's a market in a particular area for that.
It's a very open question. I think I work within Worcestershire, and I have an idea, somewhere in the region of 100 premises that are licensed, which include supermarkets, firework display operators. So we've got a good understanding of what is happening in our local area. Just because somebody goes on Facebook and says they've got some fireworks for sale, unless somebody's going to do an investigation, we can't tell you categorically that that person is in Worcestershire. They could be in Poland or anywhere else just because they're offering it for sale locally. So there are challenges around that type of enforcement, and we are evolving to look at online sales, but it is a particularly challenging area because of location.
Anecdotally, it seems to me that there have been a lot of cutbacks in trading standards departments over the past number of years as council budgets have been restricted. Do you have any evidence of that?
Not specifically. We have the legislation that we are required to enforce. We have our statutory duties which we perform. We have our businesses that we need to visit. For fireworks ones, we're required to risk assess the premises that are of higher risk and inspect them. So we still perform those duties. I think there's a variety of levels of trading standards throughout the country. I can't comment on anywhere else really.
But would tracking down illegal sales require more resources than you have at the moment? Is that what you're saying?
It's a challenging one because it's a different area of enforcement that we used to. So historically we might go to a car boot, for example, to seize DVDs. Now it's more online streaming. So the way people are buying things, their habits are changing. So we as an enforcement authority are having to change the way that we look at those.
Yeah, that's interesting, but it doesn't really answer my question. Do you actually need more resources to track down the online sales, or is it simply a question of training people differently?
I think training is probably a good one because we are changing and so we have to adapt to that change.
But do you have enough people to do it, is what I'm asking?
I can only
with all the other statutory duties you have.
Yes, I can only comment in terms of my own authority.
Yes, indeed.
And we are performing our statutory duties. Outside of that, it's a policy decision that sort of outside my remit, really.
Thank you, Daniel Zeichner.
Thank you, Chair. I'd like to address some questions to Ed about convenience stores. How important a market for convenience stores are fireworks?
I think from our research and from the conversations I've had, this is a very small part of our market now. It's declined quite considerably over a number of years and it looks to continue to decline. And that decline has been quite sharp and quite quick. And I think from talking to retailers, there's a few factors driving that. One is as convenience retailers perceive it, less demand for the product and use at home. And secondly, it's the way that consumers are shopping for the product because of the time periods in which they're restricted to sell them. It might be that a consumer is having a celebration in some way and therefore they're getting a big shop, they're filling their basket up, and also at a supermarket there's also these products, the fireworks on sale, therefore is more convenient and part of a planned shop to purchase those things. So I think they see, it would have been a much bigger part of our market 10, 15 years ago, but convenience has really dropped off and it's actually more gone to supermarket purchases, I think.
So if there were to be a ban on purchasing fireworks from convenience stores, how significant would that be for your members? Well,
it would still be significant for the retailers that are selling it, obviously, and I'm not going to, in that sense, advocating a ban. Our research suggests that 7% of convenience retailers are still selling or licensed to sell fireworks, so that's still a proportion of the market that want to sell them. In that sense, I wouldn't support that. A ban overall.
But for that 7%, would that be the difference between survival and not?
That's a difficult question to ask. I think probably more evidence about how much they're selling. I suggest, from everything I've heard, it's a small proportion, but for some businesses it'll still be important. So I think there's a distinct way in which retailers might sell these products. So it might be that they are deciding to do it as a very big part of their business. They'll have a storage container, they'll have various licenses, and they'll be supplying a local school or a community display in some way. Or it might be that they're just doing a very small amount. So I think a common theme through this issue, whether it's from retail or whether it's from antisocial behaviour or nuisance or enforcement, is that there is a lack of real evidence and data to get underneath this. And I think that would be a great recommendation out of the inquiry, is to see how we can gather more evidence on it. And we're committed to do that. The question that we have in the field around those 7% of retailers doesn't really tell us the full picture. So we're going to put commission some more research to try and find that out, and we'll share it with the committee and Bays and others that are interested.
And in those 7%, How much staff training is there, do you think, on advising staff on whether they can then give advice to customers as to what's appropriate for their gardens and what kind of safety precautions they should take?
So there will definitely be training on how to store the product and selling the product across different categories around age restrictions. And that's covered in our selling fireworks guide, which we submitted as part of our evidence, so there'll be that information. There'll also be, obviously, included in that is about the labels and information that is included with the fireworks product. I think there's, a certain extent, it's difficult for how much information staff are trained to then tell customers, because actually I think it's hard, verbally advising customers on how to use the product and being able to track that from an enforcement perspective for the customer to have recourse on that. So actually I think the best way to get that information across is through the information that's on the product, which seems to be quite clear and comprehensive, and also the increasing amount of information that's included in the package about the supply and the legitimacy of that product.
And in terms of that training, how confident are you that is that training you would hope people get, expect people get? Do you have evidence that staff are being trained?
I don't have now the information, but I know from conversation with retailers that there are very robust procedures around products that we sell which are regulated. So as a sector, we are constantly dealing with regulated products, alcohol, tobacco, and other things. So therefore, they're a big part of a convenience store's business is about training staff and making sure they're aware of those things. To give you a figure on the satisfaction and the amount, I can't do that, but I can certainly seek to find more feedback. But I'm reasonably confident that if a retailer is deciding to sell fireworks, that they would have part of that process to think about how they train their staff.
Which brings us on neatly to the licensing conditions. Perhaps you and perhaps Rachel could explain to the committee what licences are required for shops to sell fireworks, who issues those licences, and what it takes to gain and keep a licence. I don't know whether Rachel could help us with that.
So from a trading standards perspective, if somebody wants to store and sell fireworks all year round, they would require an annual licence. That cost of £500 to the local authority. If it's under 2 tonnes, once it goes above that, then it goes to the HSE for larger sites. They can just get a storage licence, which a lot of the smaller retailers would look at if they're going to just sell during the core periods, October, November, Chinese New Year, Diwali, and New Year. So those are the two from a trading standards perspective. And we tend to find that it's the supermarkets, not as much convenience these days, supermarkets and the display operators that take advantage of those from the local authority. I would say larger ones. Paul, maybe able to comment on.
Yeah, I mean, we just license above 2 tonnes, and obviously above that level, the requirements are very much on looking at who they are, they fit and proper people to store and sell them? Do they understand how they should be stored? Is the building suitable for storing large quantities of explosive material? That's in terms of the fabric, in terms of its location. Is it in the proximity to people, the proximity to public pathways, etc.? So are they maintaining the separation distances required? So there are a whole number of features that will come depending on the amount that they want to store and very much about the location. So we just have just slightly more than 200 licensed sites. Most of these are commercial enterprises that are going to be involved in sort of display type stuff rather than the retail industry. But we do have some licensed premises which are both carry out display work but also act as retail as well.
I'd say 2 tonnes sounds like quite a lot to me.
It is, yeah.
How big a space do you need to store 2 tonnes?
Of explosive, it depends in the form it's in. Obviously, if it's in individual rockets and things, it's a pretty big space.
That's not your average corner shop.
No, you're not talking your average corner shop. So you'd expect it to be a warehouse. If it is a retail premises, you'd expect it to be some sort of warehouse attached to to the retail premises.
But my understanding is that that small corner shops can store up to 5 kilograms without a license. Is that correct?
Yes.
And so basically, some are selling without any license at all. That also is correct?
It appears so.
Do we know how many?
No, so that 7% figure that I referenced is around how many convenience retailers indicated that they had a licence. Actually, that doesn't distinguish between a licence to store or a licence to sell, hence why we're asking additional questions to try and find that out. My sense is, from talking to people, that actually that's people that have a storage licence, that the bottom end storage licence, the above 5k, that are then selling within the designated periods, so not having the selling licence. But I'll have to come back and clarify that when we have more information.
And do we have any statistics on those numbers of licences, and have those altered in recent times? Are they going up, down?
I think just to clarify on the 5 kilogram issue, it was initially in place so that the types of businesses that would have cake sparklers, party poppers, Christmas crackers, F1 fireworks, the lower category ones that you could set off inside a building, that retailers could have those all year round and not be subject to a £500 licence. It gave them that element of comfort. I think we have seen over the last few years people looking at the regulations thinking actually we can have 5 kilograms of fireworks and sell them all year round, or that then gives them a little bit more room in terms of fireworks. From an enforcement perspective, it's probably the one area that would be preferable to tie down a little bit more, because if you can have 5 kilograms of F1, which is an indoor firework, it's completely different to 5 kilograms of an F3 product. So it is one area that I know that there are some concerns about, and there's obviously interpretation in terms of what that 5 kilograms means.
So what would you do to tighten that up?
Personally, if it said 5 kilograms of F1, that would be the easiest. I think probably there may be some disagreement from convenience stores because it would limit them for some products. Some of the sparklers are now F2 products, so it may limit their business slightly. I don't know what impact that would have, but certainly from a safety perspective, it would be a lot safer to have 5 kilograms of indoor fireworks than it would 5 kilograms of fireworks you'd set off in your garden.
Thank you. That's helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. At the last evidence session, we put up some pictures of some of the fireworks, consumer fireworks, which are packaged, it appears to us, to be aimed at children. I don't know if you're familiar with things like the Funky Frog and Fireworks Minion. They look like toys. It's a question really for Rachel and for Edward. Do either of you think it is appropriate that age-restricted products should be packaged in that way? Do we need tighter restrictions on packaging?
We haven't had any evidence of underage sales. The products themselves come in such a variety of packaging. I am familiar with the Funky Frog, and it is a fantastic firework. I think it comes down to points that were made earlier that it has to be somebody over the age of 18 that is purchasing it, and it should be used in line with its instructions and stored safely and carefully. There are other products that are child appealing that you may not want a child to have. So a toy train that's someone has set up as a collector, it's very appealing to a child, but you wouldn't necessarily want a child to play with it. So there
doesn't explode in their face.
No,
does
that's
it?
true.
Not generally.
But they are products not designed for children, the same way you've got pink gin now. It's still an age-restricted product, but it's pink.
When you say you've got no evidence of underage sales, do you still make test purchases?
We're working much more on an intelligence basis now, so we're collecting information to see if there is anything. So we've got no evidence of underage sales at the moment for fireworks, no complaints. Within, obviously I can only comment for the time being on Worcestershire, from FELG as an organisation, we are a technical advisory group that's made up of not just trading standards but environmental health. In some areas this legislation that is enforced by trading standards is also enforced by the fire service. So it's not just a trading standards issue, it is a much wider remit. So as a group we represent a much wider enforcement set of authorities. And we get a reasonable picture within. We have a representative from Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the different regions within the UK. So we do tend to get a good overall picture of what's happening.
I think that's an interesting point. Perhaps goes towards Edward's point about the need for more evidence, since absence of evidence is not evidence of absence, is it? Edward, what do you think about this packaging issue?
I'm not sure I have a view I can share. It might be one more for the manufacturers, but from an age restriction perspective, we are very good as a sector at delivering and enforcing age restrictions. The penalties are pretty heavy if you fall foul of them, and we have lots of policies in place like Challenge 25. And for those reasons of that getting better over time, the trend we see for how young people would access products would actually be not going directly to the store. It would actually be through a proxy purchase, asking an adult to buy it on their behalf in some way to get it. So I can't comment on the packaging. I haven't seen no evidence again that there's a problem around age restriction, and there are still test purchasings that happen to sort of test that as well.
Yeah. One of the issues that occurred to us is that although the industry told us the packaging was designed to appeal to families, and that's understandable, but even if the age restrictions are always strictly adhered to, doesn't that kind of packaging almost encourage children to play with these things when they're at home, rather than indicate that there's something that, you know, you shouldn't go near? Do any of you have an opinion on that? Liz?
Again, I can only go on a personal opinion, and I would probably agree with you. However, I'm not in trading standards, and I understand as well that if children are looking at that, then they wouldn't be able to read the instructions, so it could be something that may need to be looked at.
Yeah. Anyone else? Paul, you looked as if you wanted to say something.
No, I mean, it would be purely opinion, but I guess going back to the question about age restriction, the flaw in that would inevitably be once you get them home. So you haven't really got control over how they're going to be used in a household. Right. You expect parents to be responsible.
Thank you. Martin Day.
Thanks. The regulations around the noise nuisance of fireworks, it's been suggested by a number of witnesses, are unenforceable because of the transient nature of fireworks going off, or the ability to track where the noises came from afterwards. How much of a problem is that for environmental health officers?
I think because the legislation is very much based around nuisance, and with nuisance law there's sort of private and public nuisance, and it also has quite a lot of case law that you need to look at how often it is happening. Do you need, how loud is it? How is it affecting people? And you need to gather that evidence before you actually carry on and go down the nuisance route. And with the transient things like fireworks, it's usually one day in one premises. The legislation doesn't allow for the cumulative effect of the noise and the nuisance from things for that.
Mm-hmm. So under current regulations, somebody who's setting them off in their own garden perfectly lawfully within the correct time limit, within the correct noise level of fireworks that they're permitted to use, is there any of those circumstances that could constitute a nuisance? And
It's unlikely.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I kind of think that as well. A number of the petitioners we've had have complained about fireworks being set off in domestic gardens over such a long period, and there's certainly been a perception that the season for fireworks has grown, it's extended by weeks, if not months. Is that the experience that you've had as well?
Yes, there is the fact that it does go on now from October up until at least January. personal experience recently was that there was fireworks going off where I live on summer solstice. So, but again, one of the things, it was after 11 o'clock. There is legislation that can actually deal with that, but again, that is for the police to actually look at that after 11 if it's outside the that sort of legislation.
Yeah. So the current curfew between 11 p.m. and 7 a.m, do you feel that's enough to protect animals and people who are sensitive to noise over that new season?
Again, it can actually cause problems for people within that time. So again, we would need to look at perhaps gaining some evidence on how it is affecting people. It's difficult to look at the aspect of statutory nuisance when you're looking at prejudicial to health side of that piece of legislation. You would need to actually try and prove that it is prejudicial to health. And again, case law has suggested that you could not use noise relating to prejudicial to health.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, Damien Moore.
Thank you, Chair. This is to Rachel and Liz. So a lot of people have said to us that they believe that domestic fireworks are being set off in gardens that are far too small, or potentially indeed yards. Are people committing an offence by doing this?
With organised events, then you can actually use the Health and Safety at Work Act if there is somebody at work. With somebody in their own garden, there is nothing available that you can actually sort of say, well, actually that is a problem. That's going to be more private action if there is something that goes wrong. There is guidance available for, which used to be the HSG, the Health and Safety Guidance 123 and 124, which is now the red and purple guidance. And they have some suggested figures for distances. If you tried to apply those within a home, then no, they would not be acceptable. Okay, so the guidance, and it's more to do with the working environment than a domestic environment. Or if somebody's having a commute, the guidance is more for your organised events and displays. Okay.
There are two documents, the red guide and the blue guide, produced by the Explosive Industry Group. Two separate documents, one for professionals and one for non-professionals. They are quite useful documents with information and separation distances in them. I'm sure they are, but I'm just wondering how many domestic users actually would read either of those documents, or how many indeed read the instructions on the side of the box or on the side of the firework and maybe think that they know better. Yes, I mean, it's exactly that, and they would maybe measure their garden at being 10 metres and think, fantastic, we'll set it off at the back of the garden, not appreciating that their neighbour behind has got an LPG tank or something equally. It's happened, behind their fence. And not everybody can measure accurately. So given the fact that we can't really take any action on the distance, do you think that there should be more awareness of the distances that you should set fireworks from, and of course distances surrounding properties, because it might be the case that you're setting a firework off from a safe distance from your property, but it might be quite close to someone else's, or indeed one of the things that's come about animals. Often animals are kept outside, domestic animals as well. So do you think there should be more awareness and it should be more explicit on the box, rather than having a nice picture of a funky frog or whatever else on the front, that a bit like we do with so many other products these days, put the warning on the front before you get inside to the goodies that are in there? Obviously we've got legislation in place, the Pyrotechnics Safety Articles 2015, which talk about the labelling and what should be on the labelling, the CE marking, and that is already there. The instructions are there, and they are of a reasonable size, information, safety distances. Can we guarantee that everyone's going to read them? I think we all know from any purchase that we buy, that not everybody reads those instructions. We can encourage them to read them. We can encourage retailers to have that conversation with customers when we go and do inspections. We can, mentioned earlier, training, make sure that they have gone through that training so that information is then passed on to the customer as much as we possibly can, but we can't control what happens in a domestic environment, and it's the same for any consumer product. Once they've bought it from the shop and they've had whatever instruction, it's in their hands about what they're going to do with it and where they're going to set it off.
So given the fact that we don't really have any guarantees, if we may be warned, I don't know quite how enforceable this would be, but if we may be warned, the people that didn't use them properly could be subject to prosecution if they didn't, and potentially may result in a ban on sale of domestic fireworks. Would that maybe focus people's attention a bit more, do you think?
I think we've seen with underage sales where there's been quite a push to show, this is the punishment for it, the Challenge 25 that's come in. It feels that it's been quite a strong campaign that's helped to reduce underage sales, so much so that we're not really seeing any evidence of it now. So I think if there was a way to highlight the consequences of your actions, then I would be behind it, definitely.
All I'm saying is I don't always think it's only underage people that would be necessarily misusing fireworks in an antisocial way. I think that there potentially would be lots of over 18-year-olds doing that as well.
Yes, I agree. It's communicating the right information to the right people at the right time.
My only thing would be is how you would actually enforce it. You would need to be there to experience it or have evidence of it.
People have got phones these days now more than adept at filming and taking photographs, so maybe that would be a start. But I think that the danger, and obviously the reason we're having this is because we get a lot of complaints from people that would want to see us make that ban on domestic fireworks. So if we're to investigate this, we're looking at all the reasonable behaviour, but we don't have guarantees always of that reasonable behaviour. So the risk is, for some people can be quite high, certainly when people are weaponising fireworks, not just by accident next to the neighbour's house, but intently firing rockets in a particular direction, and I don't mean up. So, there might need to be something.
But it is a balance, so you've got to consider both sides of it. I think last week the term unintended consequences was used, and that some of these smaller retailers are getting a large quantity of fireworks to support their local community groups, to support their local schools, and those schools are generating an income for that school to purchase things for those schools or for the scout groups. So there are positive sides to the events that are being organised from these fireworks as well. So
I think, can I just add to that, is that is where our registration scheme that we use, it's not just professional firers, it's the community groups that can be registered as well or licensed, so they would still be able to continue, and at least you are looking at the risks and the flaws in their proposed events before they actually start.
That's a registration scheme run by the council, is it?
It's a voluntary scheme.
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Chair.
Daniel.
Yes, primarily to Paul. We've heard in previous evidence that the industry thinks that if there was a ban, it could lead to the proliferation of an illegal grey market in dangerous illegal fireworks. What do you think?
Again, a certain amount of speculation in the answer, really. I guess we do have market surveillance responsibilities for certain types of fireworks and pyrotechnics, largely for the commercial type used in displays and the like. That's intelligence led, and we do have the ability to take enforcement action in relation to that. We don't get a lot of reports at the moment in this. You do hear anecdotally some of these things, but we don't actually have that much evidence of of there being a major problem in this at the moment. So yeah, it is a possibility, but again, we don't see the evidence for that.
Any evidence from other countries that people have seen?
I think it was mentioned that there was a study that was going to be emailed in, a copy of which you've got a copy.
Yep.
So there have been some work with organised crime to look at it, but we're not aware of anything specifically.
How difficult would it be for you to deal with that?
There are challenges with investigations where you have multiple agencies, resources allocated to it, priorities. It's a decision above my pay grade, I think.
So it could be dealt with, but it would require resource.
Yes, and I think there are things in place already to deal with those type of things, so it doesn't tend to be a local authority enforcement level, to be honest.
Thank you.
It was clear to us before we started, and it's very clear now, that of course licensing and enforcement of the fireworks regulations falls across many different agencies, councils, police, HSE, and so on. Is that division of responsibilities, do you think, clear enough? Paul, I wonder what your thoughts are on that.
Yeah, I think the legislation is pretty clear in terms of the demarcation, in terms of the actual licensing side of it, and the regulation of certain types of materials and certain types of products. It is very clear whether it's trading standards or the Fire and Rescue Service in some side are also the licensing authority, or HSE. So I think that is clear. Our role, we do work across. So we provide advice to local authorities on specialist advice in areas if need be to supplement it. We work with FELG, which has been mentioned as well. So, and with industry groups. So I think there is quite a comprehensive network across this within the legal market, within these obviously. I don't think there's any well, from our perspective, we don't get feedback from people to say they're unclear as to who should license or who should be involved with particular types of products.
Thank you. Edward, from the point of view of people who sell fireworks, are the responsibilities for who does what clear enough to the retailers?
As I understand it, yes. As I understand it, it's quite clear where you have to apply for what licence. And when I was talking to enforcement officers about that, it was about sort of how long it takes to get the licence, depending on which one you need, because you need to draw in different authorities. But from a certain extent, the point of reference for the retailer is their trading standards as the first point. So it's quite clear from our side.
Are there any issues that any of you think fall between the gaps or could be handled better than they are at the moment? I mean, I think, Liz was referring earlier to problems which the police would have to investigate before any action could be taken by environmental health and so on. Are there any issues like that you feel could be handled better than they are currently?
I think from the noise point of view is that the noise after 11 o'clock, I believe, is set within, I think it's the 2004 Act. And yeah, I thought it was. So there is that in that the police would deal with that issue. There is potential for that to actually be put back into maybe nuisance law, or to be looked at maybe. Yeah. But again, it's trying to have some legislation that we can use easily if there are issues with noise or things like that to start with.
Anyone else have a view on that?
I think that
Rachel.
The particular challenge with that is that we get a complaint about, for example, noise nuisance. Someone was setting off fireworks at midnight. It may have been last night. We don't necessarily know about it. Is there somebody there to listen to it, to be able to take that enforcement action? so that being able to get that evidence, and I think at the moment with the police issuing a fixed penalty, unless they're in the area and able to do it there and then, it's on to the next action. So it's quite a challenging one to enforce.
Indeed, yeah. Okay. Do you think that, let me rephrase that, do you think there are areas of the law that would benefit from consolidation and review? At the moment we have lots of laws and regulations that have come about over time, almost ad hoc. I'd ask each of you, is there anything that you would like to see clarified within the law or altered slightly? Rachel, first.
I mentioned the 5 kilogram earlier.
Yes, you did.
And the second one for me personally is within the regulations it states that you don't need a licence to sell during the core periods. And historically it wasn't too much of an issue because we had registrations under the previous regulations, so it was a little bit easier to explain to a retailer. However, if they feel the need to go and read the regulations now, they're the ones turning around to us and quoting, well, I don't need a licence because it says I don't need a licence here to sell. We have to explain to them, if you're going to sell and you're going to likely to store, you'd need the storage licence. But it's just that little bit of discrepancy that is just a little bit challenging, I think, sometimes. So the fact to say you don't need a licence when we're trying to get them to get a storage licence, it just sort of jars slightly.
Okay. Liz, anything you'd like to see clarified or anything like that?
I think with the noise side of it, then that could be looked at, and whether it could be taken forward. That would sort of be my sort of thing. The other thing from the point of view for the organised events and community events, it would be good to know when those are going on for people, to be able perhaps to take some action if they could in the future. So some way of knowing how that
some kind of, rather like your voluntary scheme, some kind of registration and notification.
The only thing with the registration is that you would have difficulty then with trying to make sure that the people who are doing those are trained correctly.
Yes.
We'd be in the same situation we're in Wales at the moment, where we're changing the skin piercing legislation to a licence, so you have better control over what you can and can't do.
Yeah, thank you. Paul?
Well, we upgraded it and we consolidated a lot of explosives legislation. Back in 2014, there was a very large exercise in consultation with industry, with other government departments, with local authorities. So I think we made a fairly comprehensive coverage in that legislation. We've got a lot of supporting guidance with that. Some of that's been drawn together with industry groups and is being well used and is well understood. So no, I think it's pretty comprehensive. Brexit, obviously, in terms of CE marking of products, that is base legislation that is being dealt with at the moment to make sure that we have, notified bodies and the acceptance of new standards when they come through, when we get to that point. Public liability insurance is an issue that sometimes comes up for displays. That's outside the remit of that. That's not an area for us. So that's one of the main areas that we get correspondence about, and we generally refer on to BAYS in relation to that.
Just to clarify for my sake, are you saying that people do not necessarily understand they've got to have public liability insurance?
Well, I think they need to have employers' liability compulsory insurance, which is, that's when they're acting as employers. They don't necessarily need to have, they're encouraged to have wider insurance, but whether they have the right level of that is a question we get asked.
Thank you. That's very helpful. Edward.
I acknowledge the point that Rachel makes about the 5 kilograms. I think the answer there is about better communication of what the existing legislation says, and we try to do that in our guidance, and I think that the right thing to do is try and communicate that as clearly as possible. I think in addition, coming back to the earlier point, the common theme here is more information and better information to try and piece some of this together, and certainly we're committed to trying to deliver that more information to provide some clarity around how fireworks are sold in our sector. But I think drawing together all colleagues to try and do that, and particularly from trading standards around how many licenses they issue, all the different bodies hold the information, but where's the point where it all comes together, and that would help us have a more informed discussion.
Yeah, thank you. Do the rest of the committee have anything else they want to ask? No? Well, can I thank all our witnesses for coming along this afternoon? We always say to everyone at the end, if there's anything that you haven't had the chance to mention that you feel we should know, or anything else you want to say, please feel free to email us with that, or if anything comes to mind after you leave, please get in touch with us. You've been given us some very useful and very helpful evidence this afternoon, so thank you very much indeed for your attendance. Order.